Today in the Daily Dose, the rise and fall of Adolf Hitler. After Germany's defeat in the First World War, German sailors and soldiers mutinied against Kaiser Wilhelm II, forcing his abdication from the throne on November 9, 1918. The next day, a provisional government was cobbled together between members of the Social Democratic Party and the Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany, effectively shifting power away from the German military. A new constitution was drafted in the city of Weimar, giving hope to a war-weary people. That all ended with the crippling reparations outlined in the Treaty of Versailles, and while reparations alone failed to account for Germany's ensuing financial turmoil, it directly served as a powerful catalyst for the social and economic calamity to come, both in Germany and the rest of the Western world. At first, deflation and high unemployment pressed firmly on the young Weimar Republic, and when Germany failed to pay its initial reparation installment of 20 billion marks, as assessed by the Treaty of Versailles, only 8 billion marks had reached Allied coffers by a May deadline in 1921. The shortfall was rolled into the final indemnity established by the Reparation Committee at the League of Nations, which required the German nation to pay a total of 132 billion marks in annual installments of 3 billion marks a year. While famed British economist and philosopher Maynard Keynes had already lambasted the Big Four Allied leaders for their massive financial impunity against the Germans in his wildly popular book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, Keynes yet again pushed back at the Reparation Commission's 3 billion marks a year assessment, concluding that the most the German economy could afford was about 1.25 billion marks a year, spread out over a 30-year window. While Allied leaders continued to work out the terms of the Treaty of Paris, the Weimar Republic and the German military had been putting down a string of communist uprisings and political assassinations, including Marxist intellectuals Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, who were murdered on January 15, 1919, by members of the Freikorps after the Spartacist revolt. The German right, on the other hand, remained hostile to the country's new democratic constitution, which gave full authority to the Reichstag while bypassing any authority of the monarchy or the military. Plagued by a failing economy and recent memories of mass starvation in most German cities, in 1920, Weimar leaders announced welfare payments to war victims, as well as proposed plans for youth assistance and more generous unemployment relief benefits. Leery of imposing new taxes on a war-ravaged German public to fund both reparation payments and their new initiatives, the Reichstag closed its budget gap by deliberately pursuing a policy of double-digit inflation, leading Germany's Foreign Minister Walther Rathenau to defend the tactic in a June 1922 meeting with the U.S. ambassador, comparing his country's economy to an army which is completely surrounded, and which, to preserve its existence, must break through, however great its losses, so as to get air and a chance at life for the whole. 10 hours later, Rathenau was murdered by a squad of right-wing terrorists, one of hundreds of political assassinations carried out by an enraged far right in the aftermath of the Versailles Treaty. For a time anyway, the Reichstag's inflationist strategy helped the nation tread water, and while prices of consumer goods rose 40 times the mark's pre-war value, wages and employment generally kept pace with the mark's inflationary rise. Germany's brief period of calm and rising prosperity collapsed yet again in November of 1922, after the German government failed to make a reparation payment to France, leading the new conservative French Prime Minister Raymond Poincaré to order a military invasion of the coal-rich Ruhr Valley on January 11, 1923, reasoning that French control of lucrative German coal mines would more than compensate French taxpayers for all the costs of military occupation. Backlash from the court of public opinion was swift in the United States and Great Britain, leading Keynes to write that, "I think their action is wrong on law and on morals and on expediency," while British Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald denounced France's occupation as evil. Despite a near universal condemnation of French occupation, nationalist political factions in Germany devolved into vocal outrage, leading Weimar leaders to openly guarantee financial support for a popular resistance by the citizens of the Ruhr Valley, who in turn refused to work in the occupied mines, sabotaged rail cars, and engaged in violent altercations with French soldiers, leading to the deaths of an estimated 120 German citizens and the forced exile of some 147,000 residents of the Ruhr Valley. The international political turmoil associated with France's occupation led to swift and debilitating reactions in currency markets, rapidly eroding international confidence in the mark, which led to a devastating period of hyperinflation. For instance, in January of 1923, $1 US could buy 7,260 German marks, yet by August of that same year, $1 US could buy an unfathomable 6 million marks. To make matters ever more precarious, by the end of the year, one pre-war gold mark could be exchanged for nearly 1 trillion post-war paper marks, destroying hard-earned fortunes and savings of average Germans as commerce broke down and unemployment skyrocketed to 20%. Political consequences proved to be equally catastrophic, leading to the deaths of dozens of Germans in a communist uprising in Hamburg in an attempt to secede from the Weimar Republic, while in Munich, Adolf Hitler and arch-nationalist General Erich Ludendorff staged their now infamous beer hall putsch. During the two would-be leaders' stay at Landsberg prison, Hitler wrote the first draft of Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, dictated by his loyal friend and fellow revolutionary Rudolf Hess. The Nazis continued to exploit German anger and desperation caused by occupation and hyperinflation, which in turn secured their foothold in German politics after they won 32 Reichstag seats following an election in May of 1924. The international financial order envisioned within the Treaty of Versailles continued to fall apart, prompting many leaders to agree with Keynes's assessment that Germany had been saddled with an unrepayable debt. In response, President Woodrow Wilson placed a 2-year moratorium on repayment in 1919, followed by President Warren G. Harding in 1923, who eased the pressure on the German economy by extending repayment schedules to more than 60 years, a move that was bitterly resented by Great Britain, when annual reparation payments from Germany was less than the loan interest payments the nation had taken on to fund England's war efforts against German aggression. In search of a more lasting answer to Germany's ongoing political and social crisis, President Calvin Coolidge deputized the House of Morgan as the unofficial facilitator of U.S. foreign policy on the matter of German reparations. Despite his outright contempt for all things German, J.P. Morgan and his powerful bank helped rescue the German economy through a project known as the Dawes Plan, so named after Morgan-allied Chicago banker, future U.S. Vice President and Nobel laureate Charles Dawes. Managed by Morgan's partner Thomas Lamont and Owen D. Young, the head of Morgan's General Electric and Radio Corporation of America, the Dawes Plan focused on lessening the weight of German reparations while pushing the French out of the Ruhr, with the hope of restarting European trade, which had all but collapsed under the auspices of German hyperinflation. The Dawes Plan extended Germany's repayment window by several more decades, creating a new repayment formula based on Germany's capacity to pay, gauged by the fluctuating state of Germany's post-war economic conditions. The plan also indexed the amount of reparations paid by Germany to the tax burden borne by British and French taxpayers, which in turn was based on the amount of money each Allied country owed to the United States. Other incentives included a $100 million loan to Germany, as well as a matching loan to France, provided the French withdrew their forces from the Ruhr. In what some economists have labeled a shell game of sorts, the U.S. loaned money to Germany, who turned it over to France and Great Britain in the form of reparations, which was ultimately sent back to the U.S. in the name of war debts accumulated by both nations during the First World War, effectively jump-starting European and transatlantic trade after years of crushing stagnation. The Dawes Plan was further helped along by German Chancellor Gustav Stresemann, who agreed to restart reparation payments as specified by the plan. And as German industry returned to normal after the chaos of occupation and hyperinflation, Stresemann brought about a second German triumph, this time at Locarno in Switzerland. Under the Locarno Pact of 1925, France, Belgium, and Germany agreed to honor each other's borders between their adjoining nations, while Britain promised to support any country that was invaded by a foreign power. Old enmities between the Germans and our European neighbors began to ease in response, while Germany, ironic as it may seem, no longer feared the threat of an invasion by a foreign power. Finally, at Geneva in September of 1926, Germany became a full member of the League of Nations. Despite all these improvements to Germany's economy and social order, the Weimar Republic continued to struggle with its burdensome debts from World War I, leading to the 1928 Young Plan, which lowered Germany's obligation to 121 billion gold marks, until the dawn of the Great Depression once again threw Germany and the rest of the world into a state of financial devastation. In an attempt to thwart disaster, President Herbert Hoover placed a one-year moratorium on reparation payments in 1931, and while Allied delegates attempted to write off all German reparation debt at the Lausanne Conference of 1932, the U.S. Congress refused to sign the resolution, leaving Germany on the hook for years to come. Soon after Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, he canceled all payments as he sought to overturn the entire validity of the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler's refusal was seen by Germans as an act of patriotism and courage by a people who saw reparation payments as a form of ultimate humiliation. After Germany's defeat in the Second World War, the country yet again faced off with spiraling national chaos, leaving millions of Germans displaced from bombed-out cities. By war's end, an estimated 5.5 million German combatants and some 8.8 million German civilians had been killed. Most German institutions had crumbled under the pressures of war, while the German populace sat at the brink of starvation. In 1949, Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones and eventually split in 2, and while reparation payments seemed like an impossibility at first, West German President Konrad Adenauer struck a deal with Western nations in 1953 at the London Debt Conference, which required West Germany to repay war reparations only when Germany had a trade surplus, at the same time canceling a significant amount of Germany's debt and extending the nation's repayment window. Bolstered further by the Marshall Plan, Germany became an economic miracle as it soon became Europe's fastest-growing economy. After German reunification following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Germany slowly chipped away at the last of her reparation debt, making one final payment on October 3, 2010, on the 20th anniversary of German reunification, making post-World War I Germany an ongoing study in sovereign responsibility. Founded in 1919 by a group of men who were frustrated by Germany's defeat in the First World War, not to mention Germany's crippling war reparations as stipulated in the Treaty of Versailles that heavily burdened the German economy, the newly formed German Workers' Party soon captured the attention of a charismatic army veteran named Adolf Hitler, who blamed Jews and Marxist communists for the nation's woes. Espousing extreme nationalism and a concept of an Aryan master race. After the German Workers' Party renamed itself the Nationalist Socialist German Workers' Party, or simply the Nazi Party, in July of 1921, Hitler assumed leadership of the Nazis, where his fiery speeches swelled party ranks in response to his insistence that unemployment, runaway inflation, and economic stagnation in post-war Germany could only be defeated by a total revolution in German society. Hitler's vision for Germany further congealed after the 1923 publication of Arthur Müller-Vandenbroek's Das Dritte Reich, or Third Empire, which called for the elevation of German intellectualism and nationalism, at the same time insisting, much like Hitler's emerging beliefs, that Marxism and Western-style democracy were impediments to Germany's ascendancy as a superior race and nation-state. While scholars continue to disagree regarding Brock's influence on Hitler's vision for Germany, both men came to embrace the concept of a Third Empire, or Reich, which would rise from the ashes of both the Holy Roman Empire, followed by the German Empire. During his time at Landsberg prison, following his failed government takeover at the Beer Hall Putsch of November 1923, fellow revolutionary Rudolf Hess dictated Hitler's autobiography Mein Kampf, or My Struggle in the English, which insisted that Germany was not an economic or social entity, but a racial one, requiring the removal of all non-Aryan races from the nation. He also called for Lebensraum, or living space, which saw the need for Germany to expand eastward into Russia by pushing out or eradicating the Slavic people. Published in 1925, Mein Kampf became the de facto Nazi Party handbook, earning Hitler a staggering $27 million in today's currency after he rose to power in 1933. 6 years later, after Germany had sufficiently rearmed itself for an all-out war against Europe, Hitler ignited the Second World War following his blitzkrieg invasion of Poland, making Adolf Hitler's Third Empire a foundational primer for the horrors to come. As Adolf Hitler and his Nazi Party gained strength in the late 1920s, the Nazis played on widespread discontent with the ruling Weimar Republic, not to mention Germany's pressing economic woes caused by their defeat in reparation payments following the First World War. In response to his dwindling support, in 1933, war hero and now Weimar President Paul von Hindenburg reluctantly appointed Hitler Chancellor of Germany in an effort to build a right-wing coalition against his far-left opponents. In response, the Nazis quickly suppressed their political opponents, issuing a February 4th decree for the protection of the German people, which effectively muzzled the German press and banned political marches and assemblies, at the same time raiding Communist Party headquarters in Berlin, before falsely claiming to have found seditious pamphlets encouraging an armed communist revolt. In retaliation, on the night of February 27th, the Reichstag, or German parliament, was set ablaze, destroying its gilded cupola and main chamber, causing $1 million in damage, or some $24 million in today's currency, before firefighters could extinguish the flames. Police arrested Marinus van der Lubbe at the scene, an unemployed Dutch laborer with known communist sympathies, who in turn confessed to setting the fire as an encouragement for a workers' uprising against the Weimar Republic. Tried in January of 1934, alongside 4 other communist members, van der Lubbe was convicted and beheaded before the close of the month. In its wake, the Reichstag Fire ignited national fears of a communist takeover, obliging Hitler to convince Hindenburg to invoke Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution, effectively handing the Führer dictatorial power over Germany. Hitler and his cabinet wasted no time drawing up a more permanent and expansive doctrine known as the Reichstag Fire Decree, which outlawed the right of assembly, freedom of the press, and freedom of speech. At the same time, removing restraints on police investigations, which led to the arrest, torture, and imprisonment of some 4,000 people. Hitler's brutal response to the Reichstag Fire. Some historians have fingered the Nazis themselves as the cause of the blaze, elevated Hitler's image as a resolute savior from the dreaded Bolsheviks, leading to a Reichstag assembly on the night of March 23rd, hastily passing the Enabling Act, which gave Hitler full dictatorial power over Germany. And when the ailing Hindenburg died later that year, the German army sanctioned Hitler as both president and chancellor, setting the stage for the horrors to come during the Second World War. For 2 weeks in August 1936, athletes descended upon Berlin for the 11th Olympic Games. Visitors and athletes alike were warmly welcomed, but behind the pomp and pageantry were ominous signs of a Nazi regime gone bad. The swastika was openly displayed on banners around town and at the Olympic Stadium, while the German sense of Aryan supremacy was a hard thing to conceal. After the aggressions displayed by the Germans during World War I, Hitler and his propaganda machine used the Olympics as a way to present a kinder, gentler image to a largely skeptical world. Off the field, the truth about what the Nazis were up to was hard for foreigners to miss. By 1936, Jews and other minorities had been openly stripped of their civil rights and even their citizenship, while Jewish-owned businesses were forced to display the Star of David on their storefronts. History would later reveal that the Nazis had already opened their first concentration camp by the time the Games began. Prior to the start of the Games, debate raged in the U.S. and other participating countries about whether to attend at all. But in the end, 49 nations, including the United States, came to Germany to compete. And at the opening ceremonies, visiting athletes and spectators alike witnessed Aryan athletes follow in the footsteps of ancient Greeks, bringing fire from Mount Olympus in the first ever Olympic torch relay. Popular history remembers Jesse Owens' 4 gold medals, an Olympic first for any athlete, no doubt causing great embarrassment to the Germans' belief in their Aryan supremacy. The Games also stood as a major corruption to the ideals sacred to the Olympic Games, creating an illusion of a peaceful and tolerant nation that was the farthest thing from the truth. 3 years later, Nazi stormtroopers would blitzkrieg into Poland, setting off 6 years of war that would cost the lives of 60 million people. In the early 20th century, Germany had for many years a history of youth organizations, some linked to a particular church or political party, while others were staunchly non-sectarian. Most of these groups held a common theme of friendship and healthy social engagement, and while many of these organizations united and flourished based on the strength of their leadership, by far the most predominant and lasting of these organizations was the Hitler Youth. The Nazi Party had its roots in the infant German Workers' Party, which Adolf Hitler reluctantly joined in 1919. By 1921, the organization had morphed into the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or NSDAP, with Hitler as its leader. In the summer of 1921, an 18-year-old former National German Youth leader, Gustav Adolf Link, applied for membership with the NSDAP, but was denied due to his age. Link persisted in his bid to join the organization, and in 1922, the Youth League of the NSDAP had been formed under his leadership. Membership was for Aryan German males only between the ages of 14 and 18 years, while foreigners and Jews were vehemently disallowed. When Link was ousted in 1926 for financial improprieties, the paramilitary group was renamed the Hitler Youth, roughly 1 year after the foundation of the Nazi Party. Members of the Hitler Youth were seen by most Germans as a way to ensure the future of Nazi ideology, including anti-Semitic racism and the belief in Aryan supremacy among the races of men. Training included hiking and camping, as well as weapons training, assault course circuits, and basic military boot camp preparation. The aim was to instill in German youth the motivation that would enable its members to fight faithfully for the Nazi cause, should Germany ever see the need to go to war. Emphasizing physical fitness and military training over academic pursuit, the principles of self-sacrifice were instilled in each and every member. Emphasizing the Nazi Party over secular practices, Hitler Youth were used to break up church gatherings and religious youth groups, while interfering with church attendance any chance they could get. While the educational and training goals of the Hitler Youth attempted to undermine the values of the traditional elitist structures of German society, their training also aimed at obliterating the distinctions between the classes, replacing class stratifications with the political goals of Hitler's totalitarian dictatorship. Just 12 days after Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, one of his first major speeches came in a 1933 German auto show, where he professed his intention to raise up the German auto industry through tax cuts and deregulation, with the tacit objective of growing Germany's auto industry in tandem with the nation's secret developments in aviation warfare, both actions specifically banned under the Treaty of Versailles, following Germany's defeat in the First World War. Appointing his longtime friend and failed beer hall putsch co-conspirator Adolf Hitler to head the newly formed National Socialist Motor Corps, or NSKK, both men understood the Corps' true and quite secret intention, which was to reinvigorate Germany's preparedness and ability to wage war. Working with both Daimler-Benz and rival Auto Union AG, the later a consortium of car makers including Porsche, Audi, DKW, and Wanderer, German automakers soon dominated the racing scene during the Grand Prix Formula Series of 1934, producing the fastest, most advanced race cars ever to compete in motorsport racing of its time. Producing race cars nicknamed Silver Arrows, the two companies dominated both French and Italian automakers on tracks throughout Europe, each race featuring Korpsführer Hühnlein at the starting line, dressed sharply in his metal-laden Nazi uniform. Behind the scenes, however, the NSKK had quietly trained a volunteer force of some 187,000 skilled drivers, while German automakers stood ready to crank out airplane engines, tanks, heavy trucks, armored vehicles, and the spare parts necessary for the successful engagement of a mechanized war. By the time Hitler's intentions became clear to the outside world, following his 1939 blitzkrieg invasion of Poland, as more countries fell to the Third Reich, Daimler-Benz executives forced occupied populations, concentration camp inmates, and prisoners of war to work in their factories under draconian conditions, while the NSKK's pool of drivers provided ready manpower for Wehrmacht motorized infantry divisions. The NSKK also weighed heavily in Germany's fortification of Siegfried Line defenses, while its motorcycle troops became the self-declared spearhead of the modern war. The NSKK also played a key role in the persecution and deportation of Jews, making Hitler's cavalry of the future an international missed warning sign of the horrors to come. On September 1st, 1939, under the command of Adolf Hitler, Germany launched a coordinated attack on Poland from the west, south, and north, in clear violation of the post-World War I Treaty of Versailles, Treaty of Locarno, and the Kellogg-Briand Pact intended to maintain peace in Europe. Employing Hitler's blitzkrieg or lightning war strategy, the Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe at first laid down an extensive bombing campaign to destroy Poland's air and rail infrastructure, along with communication lines and munition dumps, before deploying a massive land invasion by troops, tanks, and artillery, incapacitating resistance as they pushed across the country. Although Poland fronted a 1,000,000-man army, antiquated equipment coupled with outmoded thinking by Polish commanders, who chose to take the Germans head-on instead of falling back to more geographically defensible positions, in the end proving to be no match for Germany's modern mechanized forces. Civilian resistance remained defiant throughout the early days of Hitler's blitzkrieg, with citizens in Warsaw engaging in guerrilla-style warfare tactics, leading to a German bombing campaign that left 95% of the city destroyed before Warsaw's surrender on September 28th of that same year. All hope of salvation vanished after the Soviets signed the Ribbentrop-Molotov non-aggression pact with Germany, which further intensified the suffering inflicted on the Poles. On September 3rd, Great Britain and France declared war against Germany, effectively marking the start of the Second World War, at the same time prompting England to respond on the same day with bombing raids over Germany. As the Nazis deepened their hold over Poland, Hitler established operational bases that employed SS Death's Head regiments intent on annihilating any Poles who opposed his Nazi ideology, quickly establishing concentration camps to house slave laborers and to exterminate Jews and political dissidents. Hitler's invasion of Poland also demonstrated the impotence of the League of Nations and the collapse of its collective security system, setting off one of the darkest periods in recent human history, while taking the lives of an estimated 45 million people. As early as December 1941, Nazi leader Adolf Hitler ordered that plans be drawn up for the construction of an Atlantic Wall, which would ultimately set off a monumental effort to create defensive fortifications along the entirety of the west coast of Europe. Work began in the spring of 1942, and by April of the following year, almost 250,000 conscripted French laborers were at work building massive coastal fortifications, batteries, mortars, and defensive masonry walls capable of stopping or at least slowing a mechanized invasion from the sea. From the tip of Norway to the Spanish border, every beach along nearly 2,000 miles of coastline was to be made impassable. Naval guns were housed in what the Nazis believed to be indestructible bunkers, while behind the Atlantic Wall, tracks were laid for railway guns capable of hurling shells as far away as England. In the fall of 1943, Hitler became even more convinced that an Allied invasion along the Atlantic coast of Europe would soon become an inevitable reality. Known as the Desert Fox, Hitler ordered Rommel to undertake an inspection of the Atlantic Wall defenses and to prepare for what Hitler believed would be a decisive engagement between Allied and German forces. Believing also that the invasion would be launched across the Straits of Dover against the Pas-de-Calais region, Hitler ordered this sector to be given priority over other sectors of the Atlantic Wall construction project. But by mid-1944, while fortifications in and around the Pas-de-Calais region were deemed completed, other sectors were far from ready for an impending Allied invasion, particularly in and around Normandy, France. As a result of this defensive frailty, on June 6, 1944, the Allied invasion of Normandy took place at 5 beachheads known as Omaha, Juno, Utah, Gold, and Sword. Supported by 6,939 naval warships and landing craft, around 156,000 Allied soldiers and paratroopers landed on D-Day, while a total of 1.5 million Allied troops would flood into Europe via the Normandy beachheads by the end of the week. 10,500 Allied troops would be killed, wounded, missing, or made prisoner of war by the end of the first day, while the Germans would suffer a nearly equal number of casualties. 10 months later, Allied troops would storm the Nazi capital of Berlin, ending 6 years of bloodshed that cost the lives of 75 million people. Before the outbreak of World War II, attempts by German resistance groups to assassinate Adolf Hitler had all but failed in ending the dictator's life, leading Hitler to become increasingly paranoid over the recurring threats to his life, adding layers of armed guards for his protection, while frequently making last-minute changes to his schedule. As war raged throughout Europe, a group of high-ranking German military leaders began to recognize that Hitler's suicidal two-front war would lead to the total destruction of Germany at the hands of advancing Allied forces, opting instead for yet another assassination attempt before staging a coup d'etat against remaining Nazi leaders. Led by Generals Ludwig Beck, Friedrich Olbricht, Henning von Tresckow, and Lieutenant Colonel Klaus Stauffenberg, during a planned meeting at Hitler's Wolfslair bunker on July 20, 1944, Stauffenberg planted a briefcase packed with high explosives under a conference table to be used for the upcoming high-level meeting with the Fuhrer, departing the room on a trumped-up story about taking an important phone call. Unbeknownst to Stauffenberg, another officer moved the briefcase away from Hitler's seat before the bomb detonated at 12:42 that afternoon. 4 people were mortally wounded, while Hitler suffered only minor injuries, remaining well enough to keep an appointment with Benito Mussolini before giving the Italian dictator a tour of the bomb site. In the aftermath of the attempted assassination, Stauffenberg and Olbricht were arrested and executed the following day, while some 200 others were eventually tried and executed for treason against the Nazi regime. Erwin Rommel was also linked to the plot, but was given the choice of standing trial or committing suicide in an effort to spare his family. Opting for the latter, the Nazis covered up the true cause of death for the renowned field marshal before honoring him with a state funeral, making the July 20 plot a near miss for the Allies' fight against Nazi aggression. By early 1945, Nazi Germany was on the verge of total military collapse. Poland had fallen to the advancing Soviet Red Army, which was preparing to cross the Oder River between Kustrin and Frankfurt an der Oder, with the objective of capturing Berlin, 51 miles to the west. German forces had recently lost to the Allies in the Ardennes offensive in France, while British and Canadian forces were crossing the Rhine into the German industrial heartland of the Ruhr. U.S. forces in the south had captured Lorraine and were advancing toward Mainz, Mannheim, and the Rhine. German forces in Italy were withdrawing northward as they were pressed by the Allies as part of the spring offensive to advance across the Po and into the foothills of the Alps. In a nutshell, Germany's war effort was in a state of endgame. During an afternoon situation conference on April 22nd, Hitler suffered a total nervous breakdown when he was informed that the orders he had issued the previous day for an all-out counteroffensive had not been obeyed, leading Hitler to confess for the first time that Germany's war of aggression had finally been lost. Hitler then announced that he would stay in Berlin until the bitter end, taking his own life before the Allies could capture him alive. Luftwaffe chief Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring learned about Hitler's suicide pact and sent a telegram to Hitler asking for permission to take over the leadership of the Reich in accordance with Hitler's 1941 decree, naming him as his successor. Hitler's secretary Martin Bormann convinced Hitler that Göring was staging a coup, prompting Hitler to inform Göring that he would be executed immediately if he failed to surrender all of his posts. On April 28, Hitler received a BBC report originating from Reuters, stating that Reichsfuhrer Heinrich Himmler had offered Germany's surrender to the advancing Allied armies, which further threw Hitler into an inconsolable rage. He ordered Himmler's immediate arrest before executing Himmler's SS representative Hermann Fegelein. During Fegelein's execution by firing squad, the Red Army breached Berlin's defensives as far as the Potsdamer Platz, and all indications were that they were preparing to storm the Chancellery. This report and Himmler's treachery prompted Hitler to make the final decisions of his life. Shortly after midnight on April 29th, he married longtime girlfriend Eva Braun in a small civil ceremony in the map room of his bunker. Hitler then hosted a modest wedding breakfast with his wife, before taking Secretary Trottel Young to another room to dictate his last will and testament. The following day, Hitler appeared in a bunker corridor to offer his final farewell to about 20 assembled people, shaking hands with each of them before retiring to his quarters for the final moments of his life. Hitler chose a pistol and poison method, which was suggested by his physician, while Eva Braun chose cyanide alone. Per Hitler's orders, both their bodies were dragged into a garden outside the bunker, doused in gasoline and set on fire. Records in the Soviet archives show that their burned remains were recovered and interred in successive locations until 1946, only to be exhumed yet again in 1970, so that their cremated remains could be scattered to an uncaring wind. And there you have it, the rise and fall of Adolf Hitler. Today's Daily Dose documentary is brought to you by PlatoSpeech.com, a lesson planning tool leveraging content like this and much more for educators and homeschooling parents. Check out the description for more information so that you too can teach something new every day.